Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western literary canon out loud. Today we are continuing in The New Science by Giambattista Vico. We are in Book 2, Section 8. Chapter 1 is entitled Poetic Cosmography, and we begin with paragraph 710. As the theological poets had set up as principles in physics the substances they imagined to be divine, so they described a cosmography in accord with this physics, regarding the world as composed of gods of the sky, of the underworld, called by the Latins respectively dii superi and dii inferi, and of gods intermediate between earth and sky, who must have been those from whom the Latins first called medioxumi. 711. The first object of their contemplation in the world was the sky, and heavenly things must have been for the Greeks the first mathemata, or sublime things, and the first theoremata, or divine objects of contemplation. The contemplation of such things was called by the Latins from the regions of the sky marked off by the augurs for the taking of auspices, which regions they called templa coeli. Whence in the East the name of the Zoroastrians, which Bocart takes to mean those who contemplate the stars, for purposes of divination from the paths of falling stars at night. 712. For the poets, the first sky was no higher than the summits of the mountains, where the giants were halted in their feral wanderings by Jove's first thunderbolts. This is the heaven that reigned on earth, and from this beginning conferred great benefits on mankind, as we have fully explained above. Hence they must have imagined the sky to be the mountain tops, from whose sharpness the Latins applied the term coelum, also to the burin, a tool used in stone or metal engraving, just as children imagine that mountains are the columns that hold up the roof of the sky, a principle of cosmography found in the Koran of the Arabs. Two of these columns continue to be called the Pillars of Hercules, as we shall see farther on. The original meaning of columen, as applied to them, must have been prop or stay. Rounded columns were introduced later by architecture. It was from such a roof on Olympus, as Thetis tells Achilles in Homer, that Jove went with the other gods to feast on Mount Atlas. Evidently, as we said above in speaking of the giants, the fable of the Titans warring with the gods and piling up lofty mountains, Ossa and Pelion and Olympus on Ossa, in order to climb up to heaven and cast out the gods, must have been made up after Homer's time. For certainly in the Iliad he always speaks of the gods as residing on the summit of Olympus, so that the collapse of Olympus alone would have sufficed to call their downfall. Nor does this fable really fit in with the Odyssey where it is found. For in that poem, the lower world in which Ulysses sees and speaks with the departed heroes is no deeper than a ditch, and since the Homer of the Odyssey had such a limited notion of the lower world, his idea of heaven must have been equally simple, in conformity with that of the Homer of the Iliad. Consequently, the fable is not Homer's, as we promised above to demonstrate. 713. It was in this heaven that the gods first reigned on earth, and had dealings with the heroes, according to the order of the natural theogony above set forth, beginning with Jove. In this heaven justice was dealt out on earth by Astrea, crowned with ears of grain and holding a balance, for the first human justice was administered by the heroes to men in the first agrarian law above mentioned. And men first became aware of weight, then of measure, and only very slowly of number, in which reason finally came to rest, so that Pythagoras put the essence of the human soul in numbers because he knew of nothing more abstracted from bodies. Through this heaven the heroes go galloping on horseback like Bellerophon on Pegasus, and volere equo was Latin for going about on horseback. It is in this heaven that Juno whitens the Milky Way with milk not her own, for she was sterile, but with milk of other mothers of families who suckled the legitimate offspring of the heroic nuptials, of which Juno was the divinity. Over this heaven the gods are carried in carts of the poetic gold or grain, after which the Golden Age was named. In this heaven wings were used, not for flight, nor even to signify quickness of wit, but to signify heroic institutions, which were all based on the law of the auspices, as we have fully shown above. Of this sort are the wings of Hymen, heroic love, Astraea, the Muses, Pegasus, Saturn, Fame, Mercury, who bears them on his heels and at his temples, and who Caducus is likewise winged, for with it he brought down from his heaven the first agrarian law to the rebellious plebs in the valleys, as above noted. And also the dragon, for the Gorgon also has winged temples, and clearly its wings stand neither for wit nor for flight. It is in this heaven that Prometheus steals fire from the sun, the fire that heroes must have kindled with flints, and set the thorny underbrush on the mountain tops, dried out by the hot suns of summer, whence, as we are faithfully told, the torch of Hymen was made of thorns. From this heaven Vulcan is precipitated by a kick of Jove. From this heaven Pathon falls headlong in the chariot of the sun, and from this heaven the apple of discord drops, all fables that we have explained above. And finally, it is from this heaven that the ancilia or sacred shields of the Romans must have fallen. 714. The first of the deities of the lower world imagined by the theological poets was that of water, and the first water was that of the perennial springs, which they called Styx, and by which the gods swore, as noted above, on which account perhaps Plato supposed that the abyss of waters was in the center of the earth. Homer, however, in the Contest of the Gods, makes Pluto fear that Neptune may open the earth with an earthquake and expose the lower world to the eyes of men and gods. And if we assume that the abyss was in the deepest entrails of the earth, the earthquakes of Neptune would have quite the contrary effect, for the lower world must have submerged and completely covered with water. So, as we engaged above to do, we have shown that the allegory of Plato is ill-suited to the fable. In view of what we have said, the first lower world must have not been any deeper than the source of the springs. Its first deity was Diana, of whom poetic history says that she was a triformed goddess, for in the heavens she was Diana, on earth the huntress Cynthia, and companion to her brother Apollo, and in the underworld Proserpine. 715. With the practice of burial, the idea of the underworld was extended, and the poets called the grave the underworld, an expression also found in Holy Scripture. Thus the lower world was no deeper than a ditch, like that in which Ulysses, according to Homer, sees the underworld and the souls of the dead heroes. For in this lower world were placed the Elysian fields, wherein by virtue of burial the souls of the dead enjoy eternal peace, and the Elysian fields are the happy dwelling place of the manes or benevolent spirits of the dead. 716. Later the underworld had the depth of a furrow. It is to this underworld that Ceres, the name as Proserpine, the seed of the grain, is carried off by the god Pluto, to remain there 6 months, and then return to behold the light of heaven. By this will be later explained the golden bough by which Aeneas descends into the lower world, which was Virgil's continuation of the heroic metaphor of the golden apple, which we have already found to be the ears of grain. 717. Finally, the underworld was taken to be the plains and the valleys, as opposed to the lofty heavens set on mountain tops, where the scattered vagrants remained in their infamous promiscuity. The god of this underworld is Erebus, called the son of chaos, that is, of the confusion of human seeds. He is the father of civil night, in which names are obscured, even as the heaven is illuminated by the civil light, with which the heroes are resplendent. Through this underworld runs the river Lethe, the stream of oblivion, for these men left no name of themselves to their posterity, whereas the glory of heaven eternalizes the names of the illustrious heroes. From this underworld Mercury, with his rod bearing the agrarian law, as we said above in our account of his poetic character, recalls the souls from Orcus, the all-devouring monster. This is the civil history preserved for us by Virgil in the phrase hoc ille animus avocat orco, that is, he redeems the lives of bestial and lawless men from the feral state, which swallows up all mankind, and that they leave nothing of themselves to their posterity. The rod was later used by the Monges in the vain belief that it had power to bring back the dead. The Roman praetor struck slaves on the shoulder with his staff in token of their liberation, as if therewith bringing them back from death to life. Sorcerers also used in their witchcraft the rod which the wise magus of Persia had used for the divination of the auspices. Wherefore divinity was attributed to the rod, and it was held by the nations to be divine and capable of performing miracles, as Trogus Pompeius assures us in Justin's abridgment of his work. 718. This is the underworld guarded by Cerberus, the dog-like impudence of copulating shamelessly in public. Cerberus is three-throated, that is, he has an enormous gullet. The three is superlative, as noted several times above, because, like Orcus, he devours everything, and when he comes up on the earth, the sun goes backwards. For when he enters the heroic cities, the civil light of the heroes turns again to civil night. 719. At the bottom of this underworld flows the river Tartarus, and there the damned are tortured. Ixion forever turns his wheel. Sisyphus rolls his stone, and Tantalus is forever dying of hunger and thirst. All fables explained above. And the river that causes the torment of the thirst is the same river, quote, without contentment, end quote, which is signified by both Acheron and Phlegethon. Into this underworld Tydeus and Prometheus were later cast by the ignorance of the mythologers. But actually it was in heaven that they were chained to the crags to have their entrails devoured by the mountain eagle, the grievous superstition of the auspices as above explained. 720. The philosophers later found all these fables convenient for the meditation and exposition of their moral and metaphysical doctrines. Plato was stimulated by them to understand the three divine punishments which only the gods can inflict, and not men, namely oblivion, infamy, and the remorse of a guilty conscience, and to understand that it is by the via purgativa, or purgatorial journey of the passions of the spirit, which torment mankind, so he interprets the lower world of the theological poets, that one enters into the via unitiva, by which the human mind attains union with God by means of contemplation of eternal divine things, which he takes the theological poets to have meant by their Elysian fields. 721. But the theological poets had invented their fables with political matters in mind, as they as founders of nations naturally could not help doing, and all the Gentile founders of peoples descended into the lower world with ideas quite different from these moral and metaphysical ideas of Plato. Orpheus, who founded the Greek nation, made the descent, and, disobeying the injunction not to turn his head on leaving, he lost his wife Eurydice, signifying his return to the infamous sharing of women. Hercules, in every nation tells of one of its founder, also descended for the purpose of liberating Theseus, the founder of Athens, who had descended to bring back Proserpine, that is, since, as we have said, she is the same as Ceres, to bring back the sown seed in the form of ripened grain. But later Virgil, with his profound knowledge of heroic antiquities, singing of the political hero in the first 6 books of his Aeneid, and of the military hero in the last 6, gives us an account of the descent of Aeneas, more detailed than any of the others. Aeneas has the advice and safe conduct of the Cumaean Sibyl. That is, since every Gentile nation had a Sibyl, and 12 have come down to us by name, his descent was made by divination, which was the vulgar wisdom of the Gentiles. With the piety of a bloody religion, the piety professed by the ancient heroes and the fierceness and ruthlessness of their recent bestial origin, as we have shown above, he sacrifices his Socius Micinus by the cruel right which the heroes had over their first socii, as we have set forth above. He then enters the ancient forest, such as covered the land everywhere while it was yet uncultivated, throws the soporific sop to Cerberus, and puts him to sleep, just as Orpheus had overcome him with the ground of his lyre, which we have previously seen by abundant evidence to signify law. And just as Hercules had tied him up with the knot with which he had bound Antaeus in Greece, that is, with the first agrarian law, in accordance with what we have said above. Because of this insatiable hunger, Cerberus was imagined as three-throated, that is, as having an enormous gullet, the three standing for the superlative as before noted. Thus, Aeneas descends into the underworld, which we found was at first no deeper than a furrow, comes before Dis, the god of heroic riches, poetic gold or grain, being identical with Pluto, the abductor of Proserpine or Ceres, the goddess of grain, and presents the golden bough. Here the great poet takes the metaphor of the golden apple, signifying the ears of grain, and extends it to the golden bough, signifying the harvest. When the golden bough is torn from its trunk, another grows in its place, because there can be no second harvest until a year after the first has been gathered. And when the gods are well disposed, the bough readily and easily comes off in the hand of him who seizes it, but otherwise no strength in the world is sufficient to pluck it, for the grain grows up naturally where God wills it, but where he does not will it, no human industry can hope to make it grow. Aeneas then proceeds throughout the underworld to the Elysian fields, for the heroes, having settled in the cultivated fields, enjoyed eternal peace and death, if they had proper burial, as we have set forth above. Here he beholds his ancestors, and those who were to come after him, for on the religion of burial, called the underworld by the poets as already noted, were founded the first genealogies, from which, as we have also remarked above, history took its beginning. 722. The earth was associated by the theological poets with the guarding of the boundaries, and hence it was called terra. This heroic origin of the Latins preserved in the word territorium, which signifies the district with which the imperium is exercised. The Latin grammarians erroneously derived territorium from the terror of the fasces, used by the lictors to disperse the crowds, and make way for the Roman magistrates. But at the time when the word territorium arose, there were no great crowds in Rome, for according to Varro, as before cited, in the 250 years of rule she had subdued more than 20 peoples without extending her imperium more than 20 miles. Instead, the word originated in the fact that the boundaries of the cultivated fields, within which the civil powers later arose, were guarded by Vesta with bloody rites, as we have seen above when we noted that the Latin Vesta was the same as the Greek Cybele, or Berecynthia, who wears a crown of towers, that is, of strongly situated lands. From this crown the so-called Orbis Terrarum began to take form, signifying the world of the nations, later amplified by the cosmographers and called Orbis Mundanus, or in a word, mundus, the world of nature. 723. The poetic world was divided into three kingdoms or regions, that of Jove in heaven, that of Saturn on earth, and the underworld kingdom of Pluto called Dis, god of heroic riches, the first gold or grain, since tilled fields make the true wealth of peoples. 724. Thus the world of the theological poets was formed of four civil elements, later taken by the physicists as natural elements, as we have said not far above, namely the element of Jove, the air, that of Vulcan, fire, that of Cybele, earth, and that of the underworld Diana, water. For Neptune was late in coming into the acquaintance of the poets, because, as we have said above, the nations were slow in coming down to the seacoasts. Any sea extending beyond the horizon was called ocean, and any land it surrounded an island, as Homer speaks of the island of Aeolia, as surrounded by the ocean. From such an ocean must have come the horses of Rhesus, which were made pregnant by Zephyr, the west wind of Greece, as we shall shortly show, and on the shores of the same ocean the horses of Achilles, also begotten of Zephyr, must have been born. Later, the geographers, observing that the whole earth, like a great island, was girt by the sea, called ocean all the waters by which the land is surrounded. 725. Finally, beginning with the idea by which every slight slope was called mundus, whence the phrases in mundo est and proclivi est for quote-unquote it is easy, and later everything for the embellishment of a woman came to be called mundus muliebris, when they came to understand that the earth and the sky were spherical in form, and that from every point of the circumference there is a slope towards every other, and that the ocean bathes the land on every shore, and that the whole of things is adorned with countless varied and diverse sensible forms. The poets call this universe mundus, as being that with which, by a fine metaphor, nature adorns herself. Section 9. Poetic Astronomy. 726. This world system, somewhat further developed, lasted down to the time of Homer, who always speaks of the gods as settled on Mount Olympus. We have noted that he has Thetis, the mother of Achilles, tell him that the gods had gone from Olympus to feast on Mount Atlas, so that in Homer's time the highest mountains on the earth were evidently regarded as pillars sustaining the heavens, even as Abla and Calpa on the Straits of Gibraltar continued to be called the Pillars of Hercules, because the hero had taken up the burden of Atlas, who had grown tired of supporting the heavens on his shoulders. Chapter 2. Astronomical and Physiophilological Demonstration of the Uniformity of the Principles of Astronomy among all ancient Gentile nations. 727. But as the indefinite force of human minds went on developing, and as the contemplation of the heavens required for taking the auspices obliged the peoples to study the heavens continually, in the minds of the nations the heavens rose even higher, and with them rose likewise the gods and the heroes. And here, for the ascertainment of poetic astronomy, it may help us to make use of the 3 items of philological erudition. The first states that the astronomy was brought into the world by the Chaldean people. The second, that the Phoenicians carried from the Chaldeans to the Egyptians the use of the quadrant and the knowledge of the elevation of the pole. And the third, that the Phoenicians, who must have been instructed by the Chaldeans, brought astral theology to the Greeks. To these 3 bits of philological erudition, we may add these 2 philosophical truths. First, the civil truth that nations, if not emancipated in the extreme of religious liberty, which only comes in the final stages of decadence, are naturally wary of accepting foreign deities. And second, the physical truth that, by an ocular illusion, the planets seem to us larger than the fixed stars. 728. Having premised these principles, we may now say that all among the Gentile nations of the East, of Egypt and of Greece, and we shall see that it holds for Latium too, astronomy sprang from uniform vulgar origins, for by a uniform allocation the gods were raised to the planets, and the heroes were assigned to the constellations, because the planets appear much larger than the fixed stars. Hence the Phoenicians found among the Greeks that the gods were already prepared to revolve with the planets, and the heroes to compose the constellations, even as later the Greeks found the same to be true among Latins. And from these examples it is safe to say that the Phoenicians found the same readiness among the Egyptians as among the Greeks. In this way, the heroes and the hieroglyphs signifying their institutions, or their coat of arms, and a goodly number of the major gods were raised to the heavens, and put in readiness for learned astronomy to give to the hitherto nameless heavenly bodies. To their matter, as it were, the form of stars or constellations on the one hand, or of wandering planets on the other. 729. Thus, beginning the vulgar astronomy, the first peoples wrote in the skies the history of their gods and their heroes. Thence there remained this eternal property, that the memories of men, full of divinity or of heroism, are matters worthy of history, in the one case because of works of genius and of esoteric wisdom, in the other because of the works of valor and of vulgar wisdom. And poetic history gave the learned astronomers occasions for depicting the heroes and the heroic hieroglyphs in the sky with one group of stars rather than another, and in one part of the sky rather than another, and for placing in one planet rather than another the major gods, by whose names the planets have since been called. 730. To speak somewhat more at length of the planets than of the constellations, certainly Diana, goddess of the chastity preserved in nuptial relations, who lies all quiet in the night with the sleeping Endymion, was attached to the moon, the giver of nocturnal light. Venus, goddess of civil beauty, was attached to the gayest and brightest of all the planets. Mercury, the divine herald clothed in civil light, with all the wings, aristocratic hieroglyphs, with which he is adorned, as he bears the agrarian law to the mutinous clients, is lodged in a planet which is so obscured by the rays of the sun as to be rarely visible. Apollo, god of the same civil light, which gave the epithet encliti to the heroes, is placed in the sun, the source of natural light. Bloody Mars dwells in a star of the like hue. Jove, king and the father of men and gods, is placed above all the rest, but beneath Saturn, who, since he is the father both of Jove and of time, has a longer annual course than of all the other planets. His wings ill become him, if, by a forced allegory, they are taken to mean the swiftness of time, for he runs his year more slowly than any other planet. But he took them to heaven along with his scythe, the latter signifying the reaping not of men's lives, but of grain, by the harvests of which the heroes counted the years, and the wings signifying that the cultivated fields were the property of the heroes. Finally, the planets, or wanderers, with the chariots of gold, that is of grain, with which they went about in heaven when it was on earth, now revolve in their appointed orbits. 731. In view of all that has here been set forth, it must be affirmed that the predominating influences which the stars and planets are supposed to have over sublunar bodies have been attributed to them from those which the gods and heroes exercised when they were on earth. So little do they depend on natural causes. Section 10. Poetic Chronology. Chapter 1. Poetic Chronology. Paragraph 732. The theological poets gave beginnings to chronology in conformity with their astronomy. For that same Saturn, who was called by the Latins from sati, sown, fields, and who was called Chronos, or time, by the Greeks, gives us to understand that the first nations, all composed of farmers, began to count their years by their harvests of grain, the sole or at least the chief thing for which the peasants labored all year. And since they were at first mute, they must have held as many ears or straws, and made as many reaping motions as the number of years which they meant to signify. Thus, in Virgil, as learned as ever a man was in heroic antiquities, we find two expressions. The first, infelicitous, and by supreme imitative art, infelicitously concorded to express the infelicity of the first ages in expressing themselves. Quote, "After some years, seeing my kingdom, I will marvel at the ears of corn," meaning simply, after some years. The second has somewhat more clarity. It was the third harvest. And indeed, even nowadays, the peasants of Tuscany, the nation most highly regarded for its speech in all of Italy, instead of saying 3 years, for example, say, "We have harvested 3 times." The Romans preserved this heroic history of the poetic year signified by the harvest, and using the name annona for the management of the stores, in particular of grain. 733. Accordingly, Hercules has come down to us as the founder of the Olympiads, the celebrated time divisions of the Greeks, from whom we get all we know from Gentile antiquities. For it was he who set fire to the forests in order to prepare for sowing the lands, whereon we gathered the harvest by which the years were reckoned. The games must have been instituted by the Nemeans in celebration of the hero's victory over the Nemean fire-breathing lion, which we have interpreted above as the great forest of the earth, to which, apprehended under the idea of a very powerful animal, they gave the name lion, because so much labor was required to tame it. Later, the name was applied to the most powerful of animals, as set forth above in the Origins of Family Coat of Arms, and the astronomers assigned to the lion a house in the zodiac, next to that of Astraea, crowned with ears of grain. This is why in the circuses images of lions were often shown, and images of the sun. It is also the reason for the metaia, with eggs on top, which must originally have been metaia of grain, and of the clearings or deforested eyes of the giants, as set forth above. The astronomers later took the egg as signifying the ellipse described by the sun in its annual path through the ecliptic, a meaning that Manetho might more fittingly have given to the egg, which Neph holds in his mouth, instead of interpreting it as signifying the generation of the universe. 734. The natural theogony above set forth enables us to determine the successive epochs of the age of the gods, which correspond to certain first necessities or utilities of the human race, which everywhere had its beginnings in religion. The age of the gods must have lasted at least 900 years, from the appearance of the various Joves among the Gentile nations, which is to say from the time when the heavens began to thunder after the universal flood. And after the 12 major gods, beginning with Jove, successively imagined within this age, serve to divide it into 12 smaller epochs, and thus give some certainty to the chronology of poetic history. By way of example, Deucalion, whom fabulous history places immediately after the flood and the giants, and who with his wife Pyrrha founds the families by means of matrimony, is born of Greek imaginations in the epoch of Juno, goddess of solemn nuptials. Helen, who founds the Greek language, and through his 3 sons divides it into 3 dialects, is born into the epoch of Apollo, god of song, in whose time poetic speech and verse must have begun. Hercules, who performs the great labor of slaying the Hydra or the Nemean lion, reducing the land to fields for sowing, and who brings back from Hesperia the golden apples, that is the harvests, an enterprise worthy of history, not pomegranates, an errand for a parasite, distinguished himself in the epoch of Saturn, god of the sown fields. Likewise, Perseus must have achieved his fame in the epoch of Minerva, when the civil powers were already in existence, since his shield bears the head of Medusa, as does that of Minerva. And finally, Orpheus must have been born after the epoch of Mercury, for by singing to the Greek beasts, the force of the gods and the auspices, the science of which belonged to the heroes, he re-established the heroic nations of Greece, and gave the heroic age its name, for in that age these heroic contests took place. Hence, at the same time with Orpheus, there flourishes such other heroic poets as Linus, Amphion, and Musaeus. Amphion uses stones in the sense in which the Latin word for stone lapis meant a lout, and signifying therefore the simple-minded plebeians, to erect the walls of Thebes, 300 years after its founding by Cadmus, exactly as 300 years after the founding of Rome. Appius, the grandson of Decemvir, as before noted, by singing to the Roman plebs, which agitabat connubia morferarum, practiced marriages like those of the beasts of Orpheus, of the force of the gods and the auspices, the science of which belonged to the nobles, reduces them to obedience and establishes the heroic Roman state. 735. Furthermore, we must here take note of 4 kinds of anachronisms coming under the familiar general head of placing times too early or too late. The first is that of times, for our knowledge empty of facts which must really have been full of them. Thus the age of the gods, in which we have found almost all the origins of civil human affairs, passes with the learned Varro for the quote, obscure time. End quote. The second is that of times full of facts, which must have been empty of them. Thus, under the false belief that the fables were invented by the heroic poets, especially by Homer, the age of the heroes, which runs for 200 years, is filled with all the facts belonging to the age of the gods, and these facts should be put back into the age to which they belong. The third is that of uniting times which should be divided, lest, for example, Greece should seem to have passed from a state of wild beasts to the splendor of the Trojan War within the single lifespan of Orpheus, which is the chronological monstrosity to which we call attention in the notes on the chronological table. The fourth and last is that of dividing times which should be united. By such an anachronism, the Greek colonies are brought into Sicily and Italy more than 300 years after the wanderings of the heroes, whereas they were brought there in the course and as the result of the wanderings of these same heroes. Chapter 2. Chronological canon for determining the beginning of universal history, which must precede the monarchy of Ninus, with which it commonly starts. 736. In virtue of the aforesaid natural theogony, which has given us our rational poetic chronology, and taking into consideration the kinds of anachronisms noted in poetic history, now, in order to determine the beginnings of universal history, which must precede the monarchy of Ninus, from which it commonly takes its start, we set up this chronological canon, that from the dispersion of fallen mankind through the great forests of the earth, beginning in Mesopotamia, according to our reasonable postulate in the axioms, a span of only 100 years of feral wanderings was consumed by the impious part of the race of Shem in East Asia, and one of the 200 years by the other two races of Ham and Japheth in the rest of the world. At the end of that time, under the religion of Jove, and the many Joves scattered through the first Gentile nations gave us evidence above that the flood was universal, the princes of the nations began to settle down each in the land where fortune had placed him. Then ensued the 900 years of the age of the gods. Towards the end of that age, the nations, which had all been founded inland because they had been dispersed through the world in search of food and fresh water, which are not found on the seaboard, must have come down to the coasts. Hence there arose in the minds of the Greeks the idea of Neptune, whom we found to be the last of the 12 major divinities. In like fashion, among the Latins, 900 years elapsed between the age of Saturn, the golden age of Latium, and the descent of Ancus Marcius to the coast to take Ostia. After this came the 200 years which the Greeks assigned to the heroic age, beginning with the raids of King Minos, continuing with Jason's naval expedition to Pontus, and later with the Trojan War, and ending with the wanderings of the heroes and the return of Ulysses to Ithaca. Thus, Tyre, capital of Phoenicia, must have been brought from inland to the shore, and thence to an island nearby in the Phoenician Sea, more than 1,000 years after the flood. And inasmuch as before the Greek heroic age Tyre was already a famous city, both for navigation and for its colonies scattered through the Mediterranean, and even on the ocean, it is clearly proved that the beginning of the entire human race was in the east, and that first the feral wanderings through the inland parts of the world, then the heroic law by land and sea, and finally the maritime traffic of the Phoenicians scattered the first nations through the remaining parts of the world. These principles of the commigration of peoples, as we set forth in an axiom, seems more reasonable than those imagined by Wolfgang Ladius. 737. Now, in virtue of the uniform course run by all the nations, which has been proved above by the uniformity of the gods raised to the stars, as brought by the Phoenicians to Egypt and Greece from the east, we must infer that the reign of the Chaldeans in the east covered a like period of time, 1,100 years, from Zoroaster to Ninus, who founded there the first monarchy in the world, that of Assyria, and correspondingly in Egypt from Hermes Trismegistus to Sesostris and Ramses of Tacitus, who also founded there a great monarchy. And since these were both inland nations, they must have passed through the successive stages of divine and heroic regimes, and then of popular liberty in order to reach that of monarchy, which is the last form of human government, if the Egyptian division of the 3 ages of the world that had elapsed before them is to stand. For, as we shall show later, monarchy cannot arise save as a result of the unchecked liberty of the peoples, to which the optimates subject their power in the course of civil wars. When this authority is thus divided into minimal parts among the peoples, the whole of it is easily taken over by those who, coming forward as partisans of popular liberty, emerge finally as monarchs. Phoenicia, however, as a maritime nation enriched by its commerce, remained in the stage of popular liberty, which is the first form of human government. 738. Thus, purely by understanding, without benefit of memory, which has nothing to go on where facts are not supplied by the senses, we seem to have filled in the beginnings of universal history, both in ancient Egypt and in the East, which is more ancient than Egypt, and further within the East, the beginnings of the Assyrian monarchy. For hitherto this monarchy, for lack of its many and varied antecedent causes, which must have been previously at work in order to produce a monarchy, which is the last of the 3 forms of civil government, has appeared in history as a sudden birth, as a frog is born of a summer shower. 739. In this way, chronology has certainty lent to its successive periods by the progress of customs and deeds through which the human race must have marched. For by an axiom above stated, chronology has here begun her doctrine where her subject matter began, that is, with the Chronos or Saturn, after whom time was called Chronos among the Greeks, the reckoner of the years by the harvests, with Urania, watcher of the skies for the purpose of taking the auspices, and with Zoroaster, contemplator of the stars, in order to give his oracles from the paths of falling stars. For such were the first mathemata and the first theoremata, the first sublime or divine things contemplated and observed by the nations, as we have said above. Later, when Saturn ascended to the seventh sphere, Urania became the contemplator of the stars and planets, and the Chaldeans, with the advantage of their immense open plains, became astronomers and astrologers, measuring the movements and by observing the aspects of the heavenly bodies and imagining their influences on so-called sublunar bodies, and even, though vainly, on the free wills of men. This science preserved the first names that had been given to it in full propriety: astronomy, the science of the laws of the stars, and astrology, the science of the speech of the stars. Both names signified divination, even as from the aforesaid theorems came the term theology, for the science of the language of the gods and their oracles, auspices, and auguries. Thence finally mathematics descended to measure the earth, the measurements of which could not be ascertained save by the already demonstrated measurements of the heavens. And the first and principal part of mathematics bears witness to this origin in the proper name geometry, by which it is called. 740. Those two marvelous geniuses, Joseph Justus Scaliger and Denis Patel, with their stupendous erudition, the former in his De Emendatione Temporum, and the latter in his De Doctrina Temporum, failed to begin their doctrine at the beginning of their subject matter. For they began with the astronomical year, which, as noted above, was unheard of among the nations for 1,000 years, and in any case could have assured them only of conjunctions and oppositions of constellations and planets in the heavens, and not of any of the things that had happened here on earth, nor of their sequence, in which the noble efforts of Cardinal Pierre d'Ailly had been expended in vain. And on this account their work has shed little light on the beginnings or on the continuation of universal history. This is the end of Section 10 from Book 2 of The New Science by Giambattista Vico. In the next video, we will conclude Book 2, starting with Section 11, entitled Poetic Geography. Thank you for listening.